The United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East has often faced allegations of bias, impacting its role and reputation in the Middle East. Critics claim that the agency's policies and operations show favoritism towards Palestinians, potentially influencing the conflict dynamics between Palestinians and Israelis. These accusations stem from various incidents, such as the discovery of militant materials in UNRWA-run schools and allegations of incitement in its educational materials. On the other hand, UNRWA and its supporters argue that the agency provides essential humanitarian aid and services to millions of Palestinian refugees, emphasizing that its work is guided by principles of neutrality and humanitarianism. Despite these defenses, the debate over UNRWA impartially remains a continuous issue affecting its funding and operations. Here, what I found at this discussion, moderated by Barbara Slavin, a distinguished fellow at the Stimson Center. Let's watch.
That one really did raise an eye. I mean, because it was just, wow, that's really in there. So the report apparently is classified. So of course it was in the Wall Street Journal, right? And apparently, what people who have read the report and the Wall Street Journal article have told me it is in fact accurate. Now, UNRWA does the best that it can do. You know, one of the things I would kind of turn the question a little bit. UNRWA is an underfunded humanitarian and human development organization, okay? We cut back our benefits because of funding shortages. Classroom sizes get bigger. Believe it or not, we run structural deficits every year. So in other words, they range from like 37 to 75 million. So in other words, we do all we can to get through the year, make payroll, and first call on whatever we're short in the following year goes to pay that structural deficit. So the idea that a humanitarian and human development organization is supposed to have an intelligence service better than its neighbors is really just a little bit disingenuous. But the other part, you know, and it was covered in this Kelowna report, is, you know, we provide the employee list to all the host countries, including Israel. And the United States asks for it from time to time. All right? If you're going to do this, you're going to, I mean, the point of the independent review was, if you're going to do this, then everybody's got to be involved. And as the Kelowna report indicated, we haven't heard until late January, ruining my playoff game. We hadn't heard before January 25th or whatever the day was. We hadn't heard from them in 13 years. So I think sometimes people who live in glass houses shouldn't be throwing stones. You know, and Ms. Kelowna has a lot of good recommendations on employees that we're going to look at. And we're going to do the ones we can do. I mean, we said we'd implement the recommendations, and we will. But let's all remember, the UN doesn't run an intelligence agency, all right? We're a humanitarian and human development organization. So I think, generally speaking, and the challenge of our time here is that people of goodwill can disagree. And people of goodwill, though, can give the other side the benefit of the doubt occasionally. But what we've seen in this issue is there is no goodwill. Everybody seems to be locked into their own narrative. In fact, our Commissioner General, you see how I keep quoting the boss? The Commissioner General talked about this the other day. He was on the podcast Awake at Night with the head of UN Comms, Melissa Fleming. And he said, you know, just because you express sympathy for one side doesn't mean you don't have sympathy for the other. Mm-hmm. And that's, for my boss, therefore for me, you know, the thing that's really missing here.
Okay, now you have talked plenty, so we're going to give our other...
That when the U.S. did the funding pause during the Trump administration, which lasted for a couple of years, you did actually have a number of countries in the Gulf step up and add in on the Qatar, and others add in more money, or add in money in some cases, more money in others. So there was a sort of compensatory effect at that point. I think with everything going on, we haven't seen that as dramatically in the UNRWA case at this point, but there's a different regional dynamic right now as well. Bill talked about, I won't go into the number of employees and where things stand. But I do think that a lot of the charges are of obviously serious concern if you take them at face value coming from Israel. You see UNRWA facilities that are being used by Hamas. You see UNRWA vehicles that at least seem to be used by Hamas. You potentially have people who once upon a time worked for UNRWA who are aligned with Hamas, perhaps. I think those are very serious concerns and they need to be addressed. And I think a lot of people have gone into these in great depth. In this one case that was just a few days ago, this one warehouse, for example, it's clear that UNRWA had abandoned the warehouse in retrospect. I mean, it is clear.
Thank you.
That abandoned the warehouse. Did it take all the vehicles with it? No, it couldn't. Did Hamas realize that that was an opportunity, a military opportunity to come in? Because guess what? Maybe there was not going to be IDF bombing there, etc. Sure. I mean, they did a logical thing you would do in a wartime environment. Does that mean that UNRWA management and staff institutionally and systematically are complicit with Hamas? No, I don't think it does mean that. But again, the fog of war, you talked about the he said, she said, there's a lot going on, there's a lot of confusion. It's just important to keep the context, I think, in mind. We're going to talk, I would like to get back to the Kelowna report because I think the Kelowna report points to some of the longer term reforms that UNRWA itself accepts. And Bill mentioned the action plan that UNRWA's building in response to it. It's not going to take every single recommendation. I don't think anyone expected them to. Is it going to do it in the right way? Probably there will be room for improvement. But again, I want to go back to my first point. We're operating in a wartime environment. And UNRWA is under a lot of stress. You said 13,000 employees, there are only 2,500 still working. This is not a smooth running machine that is going to shift and reform and change over a long period of time. In many ways, this is an organization that's under enormous amounts of stress and already has a very difficult mandate, humanitarian, human development, you mentioned, in those areas. It is also an organization that has an infrastructure within Gaza, which is, I would say, irreplaceable in this environment right now. Sure, could you find something else in 10 years in a quieter, more peaceful place? Yes, probably. But in this environment, to just sort of say, well, let's move it aside, and now we'll start to operate, what'd you say, 60 to 70 trucks getting in, and then where does that go? The US pier has been built. It comes, the food, the aid comes ashore, and then how does it get distributed? Again, there are other UN organizations there in certain ways, World Food Program and others, but not in any scale, not with the knowledge, the relationships, the history that UNRWA has. So I think it's important to keep ourselves grounded in some reality of what the situation is like there on the ground. Why don't I stop there at this point?
We'll get back to the
Discussion. Can you all hear me? All good? Okay. As Bill mentioned, in addition to Gaza and the West Bank, UNRWA also exists in Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. I'll zoom into Jordan and Lebanon. Syria is a little bit more complex, but there is a dimension that I will get to also concerning some of the Palestinian refugees registered with UNRWA that ended up in Jordan currently. So with a country like Jordan, there are about 10 camps, and I think in the mindset of most people who have not been to Jordan or have not driven in Amman, for example, where there is a refugee camp, UNRWA refugee camp, you get a sense that it's sealed off from the rest of the city, and it's not the case. A lot of these camps have become part and parcel of the cities and towns that they are hosted in. And so the community is intermingled with others. In the case of Jordan, there's about 2.4 million Palestinians registered. And of course, those include the descendants of the Palestinians who were expelled or forcefully fled from Palestine in 1948. That aspect of it is important. We're talking about a very large number of people. Now, with these cuts, particularly significant cuts to UNRWA, a government, a country like Jordan, which has very scarce natural resources, its economy has been struggling for years, particularly post-pandemic, and now with the war in Gaza, The economy is also negatively impacted from tourism to trade. And so this is going to add more pressure on the government. The government spends about $1 billion a year on Palestinian refugees in terms of infrastructure and services. And of course, as Bill mentioned, the services that are provided are, human development services. It's health, education, vocational training, and other capacity building programs that are essential for a lot of these Palestinian refugees. And so again, this is going to add more pressure on a country and a government that is also grappling with another refugee crisis, the Syrian refugee crisis, with the presence of more than 1 million Syrian refugees. Of course, as Bill mentioned, the other refugees are dealt with by UNHCR, but that's certainly something that adds a lot more pressure on Jordan, which is, if we talk about how the top 3 countries that are impacted by what is going on, the top 4 countries that are impacted by what's going on in Gaza today, it would be Israel, the Palestinian territories, Lebanon, and Jordan. Because of close proximity, because of its relationship with the Palestinians, its historic role, but also the fact that many families in Jordan are also of Palestinian origin. I was born and raised in Jordan. At this point, there are so many intermarriages amongst Jordanians, commonly referred to in Western literature as East Bankers, and Palestinians. And so it's very difficult to sort of separate these two entities. With regards to the refugees that are officially registered with UNRWA, they still maintain that refugee status because, as you mentioned, Bill, your mandate is not a permanent one because it's linked to a just and durable solution of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And it is also linked to Resolution 194, which is the right of return. And so even though the vast majority of Palestinians understand the reality in the region, they understand that they cannot go back to where they were, their ancestors or their grandparents were from, if there were to be a resolution. But there's also a compensation issue. And so for them, it's a very important part of holding on to UNRWA and, beyond, of course, just the day-to-day services that are absolutely essential to keeping UNRWA, to keeping them running. So with Jordan in particular, this is a very essential component. Lebanon has about 12 camps, and Lebanon has its own share of political challenges, economic problems, the presence of Hezbollah, which complicates things, particularly given Hezbollah's relationship not only with Iran, but with the various other Palestinian factions that operate from various parts of Lebanon. But the reality of the situation is that UNRWA is again essential to the Palestinian refugees in those 12 camps with regards to health, education, other basic services. I was reading different, recent reports, and UNRWA services basically reduced the Palestinians living in poverty from about 95% to a little bit over, under 80%. So even with UNRWA services, we're talking about 80% of Palestinians living in poverty. In Jordan, the situation is a little bit different because a lot of them actually have Jordanian citizenship.
I have a question about this for you and also for Bill. This is one of the things that was raised. There was a hearing in the House Foreign Relations Committee on Friday where this was repeatedly raised, the idea that how can they be considered refugees when they also have citizenship, for example, in Jordan. Now, this is not the case in Lebanon, but it is the case in Jordan.
Exactly. So, and I'll get to that. But in Lebanon, not only do they not have citizenship, but they're completely shut out of the national economy and of the healthcare system publicly, and they're priced out of the private healthcare system or education system. I mean, the Lebanese themselves at this point can barely afford private schools, for example, right? So So it absolutely impacts the Palestinians there because of the absence of rule of law in many parts of Lebanon. You see more violence and more crime in some of these camps, and that of course is always a matter of it's a very serious challenge. But without UNRWA, you're going to see a lot more challenges and a lot more problems. And again, with the employment factor, because they are locked out completely of the national economy, they can only work with UNRWA. So it is significant. In Jordan, I think the contribution is a little bit over 120 million to the GDP. And we're talking about a small GDP, we're talking about a small, like a lower to medium income country. So those contributions are quite essential. Andrew, you were talking about how when the Trump administration cut out funding, that some countries in the GCC sort of stepped up. It's because the Jordanian government had no choice but to lead the effort globally and of course regionally to fundraise, because this is a matter of survival for them as well. When the unemployment rate in Jordan for youth is around 40%, if you completely shut off UNRWA and all these people, the 7,000 to 10,000 employees of UNRWA in Jordan, lose their jobs, and then of course you have graduates that are coming into the labor market, then you're going to create more economic uncertainty and instability, which almost always with everybody's sentiments right now. There's a lot of anger and there's a lot of pain, as you've described, across the region because of what's happening on both sides. And so this will just only add more fuel to the fire. It will just you're going to see a lot more, like I think a mix that is quite disconcerting with the political and economic coming together. So UNRWA is essential because I think for the countries in the region that are already hosting Palestinian and Syrian refugees, they need more support from the international community. Lebanon is important for the United States for many reasons. Jordan is a key ally of the United States on many fronts, and we've heard this from King Abdullah to the Prime Minister, to the foreign ministers, to others, that UNRWA services are vital for the survival, just the basic survival of the Palestinian people. And if we remove politics completely from that discussion. It cannot, we've talked about this sort of reform, the recommendations of the report. Any allegations should be taken very seriously. UNRWA did the right thing. This is highly important. Allegations of terrorism. But we've known for more than a decade that there are reforms that are needed. It's not a new story. Reform takes time. You don't completely dismantle an organization if some things don't work. I think the United States and others learned that lesson in Iraq when de-Ba'athification happened. You don't just completely dismantle the entire infrastructure. If you do so, you have to have an alternative in its place. In my conversations with some of the EU officials who work on humanitarian issues, their talking point, I think, is a very important one. Okay, so you want to dismantle UNRWA in Gaza and the West Bank. Okay, so, and then you want to come up with another UN agency of some sort to take its place. Great. Where do you think we're going to hire people for this new organization? They're going to be former UNRWA employees because they have the institutional capacity and knowledge and the training and the community relations. Arab culture is a highly relational culture. It's very community focused, and so those are very important factors to keep in mind. And I'll stop right there.